Okay, so we'll just wait for some more people to join and then get started.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so we'll just... Okay, so Professor Folbre, whenever you're ready, I'm happy to get started.
Okay, and are you recording this?
Yeah, so it should be live now.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome everybody that is watching. Today we are honoured to be joined by Professor Nancy Folbre. She is Professor Emerita of Economics at the University of Massachusetts. Her research explores the interface between political economy and feminist theory, with a particular emphasis on the value of unpaid care work. Her upcoming book is one that you should definitely look out for: The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems and Intersection of Political Economy. We're really excited to discuss with her today her pioneering work, feminist economics more generally, and the future of gender inequality, especially in the light of the pandemic. So a nice beginning question, I think, would be, what is care, Professor Folbre?
Care is work that is devoted to the production or the development or the maintenance of human capabilities. That is, as opposed to work that produces things, it's work that produces people's capabilities. So it can be paid or unpaid, and it's been a kind of neglected category in conventional economic thinking.
And why do you think it is that care has been neglected in economic thinking?
I think it's been easy to take it for granted because a lot of it lies outside the market economy, the work that mothers and sisters and wives do in the home. And also, I think there's a tradition of androcentrism in political economy, that because men are not very actively involved in care provision, they've never been as interested in it as women are. So what's happened is, as more women have entered the economics profession, the economics of care has become a bigger field, a more, more energetic field.
And with this greater recognition of care work as work, how do we define more broadly, or how should we define more broadly what work is?
Well, that's a great question. Many of the traditions of economic theory define it differently. So in kind of the mainstream neoclassical economic framework, work is anything that you only do in order to get utility from the product. So the work itself is a source of disutility or not rewarding, but you do it because you need the stuff that work produces, right? So that is a definition that was often used to argue that unpaid work was not really work, because the argument was, well, women must be doing it because they like doing it, so it's not really work, right? But it turns out, and this is something that we've learned from interesting empirical research, that people actually like doing their paid work too. Nothing in this world really is done just for money. There's almost always some spillover satisfaction or dissatisfaction that occurs from it. So I don't think the neoclassical definition, and it's really the dominant textbook definition, I don't think it really holds water anymore. So the alternative definition that's often used by researchers looking at unpaid work is whether in principle you could pay someone else to do it. So in principle, you could pay somebody else to wash the dishes. You could pay somebody else to look after the children. You could pay somebody else to take out the garbage, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not a wholly satisfactory definition either, because there's some things for which there's really no replacement in the market. Some activities that are not standardized and can't really be easily substituted. But I think it's a better working definition than the traditional one. And it's the one that most time use researchers use. So now you can see a lot of interesting empirical results, including from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, on how much time is devoted to different components of unpaid work, like how much time is devoted to childcare, how much time is devoted to housework, how much time is devoted to, looking for lost keys. I mean, there's all sorts of really detailed stuff in there. And the interesting thing, not just for the UK, but for most countries, is that the amount of time that's devoted to unpaid work is about the same or greater than the amount of time that's devoted to paid work. And that's because people do some every day, whether they're students or they're retirees or they're working for pay. When they come home from their job, they typically have to spend some time doing unpaid work. So in the aggregate, it's actually a greater volume of hours than hours of paid work.
So my sort of curiosity would lead me to ask next, how is this change? Do we see that this is changing over time and that our proportion of time spent on non-care work is increasing as a proportion?
Really good question. It turns out that it depends on which component of unpaid work you're looking at. For instance, it seems pretty clear from both from the US and from looking at differences in European surveys that the amount of time devoted to housework has declined over time. But what's really startling is that the amount of time devoted to children and to childcare is actually going up. And that's true even though people have fewer children. And I think part of it is that today parents spend much less time just supervising their children or being around their children, and they make up for that by engaging in a lot of specific activities when they're with their children when they can. So they report more activities. So that seems to be, that to me is a really interesting finding, is that in richer countries, actually parents have the luxury of devoting more time to their children than they do in really poor countries, where it's often more important to get food on the table, right?
Yeah, I find this really interesting, and I think it links quite nicely with how you're advocating not just for a change in our national accounting of work, but also of other things like investment and income and consumption and so on.
Yes. Yeah, it really alters the whole theoretical framework of both micro and macroeconomics in a good way, I think. It's not so much that it makes the existing theories completely wrong, but it suggests that they're really incomplete. Mm-hmm. They need to be fleshed out and expanded. And the definition of the economy needs to be bigger than it is in most textbook stories.
And sort of a slightly separate question, but so now that we're thinking in a more expanded view of what work is, and we recognize care labor as a form of work, do you think something changes in the way, or can change in the way that we view care labor? and how we practice it and its quality and nature?
Well, I think we appreciate it more now because we see how important it is to our kind of social insurance and social welfare. And that's where the pandemic comes in. You know, there was a big reallocation of time away from paid work to taking care of children and other family members at home. And it wasn't driven by prices. It wasn't driven by the, you know, kind of conventional factors in economic models. It was driven by need and obligation and commitment and altruism. And without it, we would have been in really serious trouble. So I think it's made people more aware of the tensions between care work and unpaid care work and paid work. It certainly made the women who saw their work lives, their paid employment and job careers really seriously disrupted, much more aware of the need for public policies around those issues.
And yes, I think in researching this topic more, I found that some economists fear that merging the logic of market and the family could have detrimental impacts on how we view family activities. But I would imagine that you might respond to that. Well, you could never really separate market logic and family logic.
It's funny, I don't actually get that pushback from economists who are generally quite happy to kind of make the step of considering substitutability between market work and non-market work. But sociologists often get very huffy because they see it as a kind of invasion of sociological space by economic thinking. But I always try to explain to them that my version of economic thinking is much more sociological than the conventional economic analysis. So I think it really is an interdisciplinary project. And that's why, one of the reasons why it's such an interesting research area.
And on the pandemic more generally, so how would you say that this pandemic has affected the divide in the balance of unpaid work among women themselves? Because what I noticed from your research is that you didn't just talk about this imbalance between men and women, but also across women in developed countries.
Yeah, well, it's really clear that women at the bottom of the earnings distribution, women who were employed in essential services, especially healthcare, but also retail and tourism and hotel, restaurant employment, et cetera, were kind of hit by a double whammy. Many of those jobs were lost as a result of the pandemic shutting down. So that resulted in a lot of involuntary job loss among those women. And some of those jobs women had to keep doing despite the health risks of doing them. So, maybe they thought they were lucky that they still had a job, but that job often came with a lot of health risks, not just to themselves, but to their parents and their children, their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's been very problematic. And, it's also true that women in more professional managerial jobs saw their workload increase, but many of them were able to continue earning a salary by working from home, as I do, as I'm doing right now, right? So the downside for them was just like a big increase in total workload, paid plus unpaid, and stress. So three different sources of stress felt differently by different groups across the income distribution. And in the US, and I'm sure this is true in the UK as well, there's also a big racial ethnic divide that overlaps that class divide to a significant extent.
And sort of, again, a little bit of a change in topic, but another thing that I found really interesting from your research is you talk about this growing gender gap in public policy, and that there seems to be a trend of what men and what women are arguing for or asking for in politics is becoming increasingly divided?
Yes, it is. And do you know anything about that in the UK? Is there a bigger gender divide now in the UK?
I'm not sure, to be
Yeah, well,
perfectly
in the
honest.
US, the recent elections have shown a really big difference with a plurality of women voting Democratic and a plurality of men voting for Republicans. So I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. And, part of what's driving that is that in the past, a very large percentage of women were married to men who were a very important source of their livelihood. And now women are more economically independent, and they're less likely to be pooling income with a male wage earner. And yet they're still more likely to take responsibility for taking care of children and elderly and other dependents. And that really reduces their earnings relative to those of men. So they have a bigger stake in public policies that promote more work-family balance. I mean, I think there's pretty straightforward economic reasoning there.
So I suppose that explains one half of the equation, why women are more in favor of these policies. But is there a reason why men seem to be more reluctant to support them?
Well, yeah, I think there are several reasons. I think men, in general, this is especially true in the U.S., are experiencing a kind of backlash against women's increased economic independence, and they see public policies as something that, because they might empower women, might reduce their own bargaining power over women, and that I think that is particularly evident in discussions of sexual harassment and domestic violence. Men are now under much closer scrutiny for the way they treat women in the paid workplace and also at home. And I think they see that as some men are pushing back against that because it's a reduction in their traditional privilege. On the other hand, I think there are also a lot of men who are completely happy with that change, and there's a big difference by age. So we see younger men are much more open to change. I mean, I guess that's not surprising, but I see a really big cohort effect, even in the economics profession, that younger economists are much more open to thinking about care issues than my generation is. So I always try to hang out with the young people.
Yeah, I think that's a good policy.
Yeah.
Well, so on this sort of changing nature of economics, I thought I might ask you a little bit about feminist economics, what that means, and what sort of, so what does it mean to do feminist economics?
Well, I think some people assume that feminist economics just means, trying to fight for gender equality. And that's a part of it, but I think there's more intellectual and theoretical substance to it. And to me, the first kind of premise, which is consistent with fighting for gender equality, is that women and men, to some extent, have different collective interests. That is, they're affected differently. Because of the gender division of labor, they're affected differently by different public policies and different aspects of the organization of the economy. So it kind of redirects attention away from individual decisions to thinking about groups defined by gender. And that in turn leads to a more intersectional approach that is looking at how it's also true that there's a difference in the collective interests of the rich and the poor, of the employed and the unemployed, of people of color and whites, and that there's a more sort of complex set of hierarchies that we're addressing that can't be reduced to just to gender and sexuality. So that's I think kind of the broadest implication of of my feminist economic perspective. I don't know, I can't speak for everybody who calls themselves a feminist economics, but I think that intersection of collective identities is really important. But then a second feature, which I think is really central, is that you got to pay attention to unpaid work as well as paid work. and recognize its importance to the overall economy, can't be relegated to something outside the economy. So that's where the care work comes in. And then a third aspect of it that I think is a little bit more abstract, but is maybe the most important feature of all, is that you can't really analyze economic behavior just in terms of individual self-interest, which is what the traditional textbook introductory economics does, because people make a lot of decisions to take care of others, especially family members, that are actually quite costly and to their own individual income. And if they didn't do that, we wouldn't be around to talk about it. So thinking about how, not looking beyond the calculus of individual self-interest, I think is a really important theme.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And one of the things, another thing I found quite interesting from listening to some of your speeches is that you like to differentiate, or you prefer to use the term patriarchal power structures than patriarchy. I thought that might be quite interesting to explain to our listeners.
Well, I think these big nouns that people use, like patriarchy, capitalism, racial capitalism, extractive capitalism, I think they're too broad. I think they don't respect the complexity of hierarchical systems. And I think one of the reasons why hierarchical systems are so resilient is that they're often based on kind of nested hierarchies, where there are always some people in the middle who may feel threatened by changes that would benefit those at the very bottom. And that kind of divide and conquer outcome is why you can see such a strong concentration of wealth and power in the top 1% of the global population, is that the 99% are to some extent fighting among themselves.
And so, who would you say in the US right now is the middle? That
Well, on a global level, everybody in the US is in the middle. That is, it's a tremendous privilege to live in a rich country like the US and to gain access to the resources, the health, the education, the broadband, right? All of those things. So you may be at the bottom of the earnings distribution in the US, but on a global level, you may feel very threatened by globalization, migration, open borders, et cetera, because you're afraid it's going to worsen your relative position. So it's also true if you look at feminism, and women have shown a distinct ability to engage in collective action to improve their position, but there are also big class and race differences among women, right? And in fact, it's always been a lot easier for women in a privileged race and class position to implement policies that benefit them rather than women at the bottom. So that's an example of the kind of contradictory complexities of an intersectional approach. And I think it raises questions about how to best create alliances among disempowered groups. And to do that, you have to really understand what's driving the inequalities among them. Kind of a long answer, but.
No, it was a very interesting answer. Thank you. I suppose, well, you answered it, I suppose, but I would like to ask anyway. So how do we build that coalition then?
Well, I think that's why I think social theory and political economy are so important, is that we need to be able to explain inequalities that emerge. We need to be able to show people how they, are not like a natural fact of life, and they're not a God-given regime. They're actually created by a lot of forms of collective action, and the whole process of kind of social evolution of our species is trying to figure out how to cooperate effectively and overcome conflict. And I guess my hope is that by taking an intersectional approach, we can better understand the gains from cooperation and mitigate some of the conflict that I think is leading to a tremendous waste of resources and really undermining our future, really, on a planet that is experiencing a lot of environmental stress.
So, as you say, you know, about to combat this process, you have to understand it. And so, my question would be, how did we get here? How did these patriarchal power structures, as you call them, evolve and grow in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the controversial things I do in my book is I kind of embrace some insights from evolutionary biology, not the old-fashioned evolutionary biology that was kind of based on every man for himself, but what's called the theory of multi-level selection, which says that individuals compete with each other, but it's also true that groups compete with each other. So what that implies is that people often find themselves in a contradictory position where within their group, they're competing with everybody in their group to get resources, status, money, jobs, partners, etc. But if they compete too much with one another, they weaken their whole group. And part of their standard of living and well-being is determined by their group's success. So there's this tension between competition and cooperation. And it's a kind of a complicated dynamic, but I think if I were going to just reduce it in a very bold and perhaps oversimplistic way to answer your question, I would say that often hierarchical groups are able to outcompete egalitarian groups because they impose more discipline that forces people to cooperate through kind of institutional power structures. So we know from, or we think there's evidence that once upon a time, there were human societies that were pretty egalitarian in gender and class terms. And they basically got extirpated and exterminated to a very large extent by groups that were more hierarchical, including more patriarchal. So an example of one of the ways in which patriarchal institutions could help a group achieve power would be if you're in an economic regime where the size of your population is really important to your success. So if you have more soldiers than the neighboring group, you can take stuff away from them, right? Well, one way to increase your numbers is to steal women, to attack other groups and take young women and basically make them a part of your group, get them pregnant, subordinate them, and increase your population that way. So it's not a good outcome for the women who have very little choice, but it might benefit the group as a whole by giving it the power to invade or expropriate other groups. So in a way, that the story is a little bit similar to the story that Karl Marx tells about the emergence of capitalism, right? That capitalism emerges because it offers some important advantages to the groups that manage to make a transition to capitalism, but it does so by enforcing some hierarchical inequalities that are very costly to some members of the group. And what it sets in motion then is a kind of permanent struggle between disempowered groups over how to distribute the benefits of cooperation in a more democratic and egalitarian way. So to me, that's the challenge. How do we develop a society that's more cooperative without making everybody cooperate at the point of a gun or at the point of being unemployed, right? And I think we have to do that through persuasion. So we need to become more persuasive.
So does this give us sort of reason to be worried about the sustainability of a truly egalitarian society?
Yeah, absolutely. If we, it's a warning against kind of the idealistic notion that you sometimes hear on the left, like, oh, if we could just get rid of neoliberal capitalism, everybody would cooperate and we'd have co-ops everywhere and there'd be mutual aid and you know, flowers would bloom everywhere. I think that's a very naive vision. It takes a lot of effort to persuade people to cooperate. You have to develop the skills. You have to develop the institutional structure. You have to develop the kind of cultural norms that enable it. So I think we're sort of groping our way towards that. And one of the reasons that we are groping our way towards that is that we face a challenge that requires global cooperation, and that challenge is climate change. So in a sense, we're to some extent, not completely, but to some extent, we're in a situation where the choice is cooperate or die, right? Or cooperate or sacrifice future generations. So I think we're coming to a recognition of a problem that can't be solved by markets. And I think that is going to encourage ways of thinking about the political economy of cooperation.
So do you think in that way the global pandemic could help speed these processes in that it requires global cooperation in a similar way?
I think it's a good lesson for us because what we see is, on the one hand, we see a lot of defectors, that is members of society who are saying, you know, no, I'm not going to cooperate. No, I don't like this. No, I'm not going to wear a mask. No, I'm not going to get vaccinated, et cetera, because, you know, in a sense, that's the consistent with a worldview that I think economists have contributed to, right? But on the whole, if you look at what's happened, the overwhelming majority of the population in most countries has really cooperated, right? And I think as the benefits of that and the necessity of that becomes more clear, I think that's going to alter people's perception of the world. I hope so. I think it's our job to try to make that happen, right? So I can't guarantee that we'll succeed, but I think we have a fighting chance.
Yeah, that's really quite hopeful
Yeah.
and positive. I suppose my only thought about that would be when you notice that I think the US has had particular trouble with defection in that way. Does
Yeah.
that, you know, spell some worries in particular with the US?
You know, in the US, what's happened is I think a kind of confluence of nationalist and racist strategies that represents a kind of fearful response on the part of a lot of Americans who have seen their standard of living decline at the bottom of the income distribution and think that the reason for that is, you know, can be blamed on the Democratic Party. And I think they're about to get a lesson in why that's not the case. So we'll see if it works or not. But I think it might.
And so who is to blame if there is anyone to blame for that situation, for those people?
I don't think anything. I wouldn't say there's anything to blame. I mean, I think I'm a you know, as a social scientist, I try to think about how societies evolve in ways that we're not always aware of, and we don't always understand the consequences of our choices. And it's actually pretty confusing to figure out where our interests lie and who we should ally ourselves with. And I think that difficulty makes it easy for demagogues like Donald Trump to kind of create false promises that are very seductive. But I wouldn't blame Trump for what happened. I think it's, you know, if it hadn't been Donald Trump, it might have been somebody else very much like him. I think that there were actually deep divisions in US society that kind of set the stage for some shifting political alliances. And not surprisingly, we see very similar dynamics in other countries like India, Brazil, Russia. So it's clearly not just a US phenomenon. I don't understand the UK well enough to put it in into the equation, but that's something you might think about, or others in the UK who watch this video, might think about. But I do think the nationalism and racism formula was very much driving Brexit in some very fundamental ways. And again, we'll see what happens.
So, it's another change of topic, if that's okay. But I wanted to bring up this particular case because I thought it was quite interesting and relevant for today, that you may have heard about, where a Beijing divorce court ordered a man to pay. So during divorce proceedings, obviously, ordered a man to pay compensation to his wife for the housework that she'd done during their marriage. And it was about $8,000 and about £5,000. And it created quite a stir. So I just wanted to hear your views on that case.
Well, China is modernizing very fast, and there's actually a pretty strong women's movement in China. And there's a really great younger generation of women economists in China who are doing really cool and really important work. And, most countries have some, most advanced countries, affluent countries, have some policies that are like that for displaced homemakers. Not necessarily alimony, but at least a payment to help women who've basically specialized in unpaid care to get some transitional income if they go through a divorce. So it's basically China catching up with, in that respect, catching up with family laws that have been put in place elsewhere. And I think family law is going to continue to be a very big kind of bone of contention in the policy world. And you can already see this in most countries, especially, I think I would highlight one particular issue, which is requirements for the child support payments of non-resident fathers. And there's a lot of bargaining and pushback about what the right way to do that is, right? And also, to what extent a national budget should be devoted to provision of services that are benefiting families. And in the UK, there's a really great feminist group, the UK Women's Budget Group, that's done very specific analysis of the impact of recent policies, austerity, cutting social spending, alternatives, how things would look different if the government invested more directly in care services. So I think it's a great area of research, and I hope some of the people in your group are drawn to it as an arena of study.
Yeah, I think it definitely does sound very interesting, and I'd personally like to look into it more. But sort of my question about this is, to what extent does recognizing care work properly and paying care work properly rely on policy change, and to what extent will it be dependent on a cultural shift?
Well, it's both. I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's both. Cultural values and cultural norms really help us collaborate. They're kind of implicit rules. So in a sense, the distinction between the cultural and the economic is not as big as you might think, because cultural norms themselves can be a really important economic resource. Like if we strengthened norms of fair play and economic justice, if we could strengthen those norms, that would have economic consequences for every group that is currently disempowered, not just for women. And that's why I think thinking about, what we think the rules of a good society should be, is really important, because that itself is a cultural battle, right? To say this is possible, another world is possible, we could do better.
And how do you go about changing cultural norms then?
You think about them, you talk about them, you write about them, you dream about them. What else?
Yeah, which is exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is fantastic. I'm going to check now if there's any questions in the comments or on the Google form and see if anybody else would like to ask something.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a question from Alice Palmer. To what extent, to what extent do you believe social democratic welfare states, such as the Nordic, are better suited to promote egalitarianism in the labour market?
To a great extent, but also not to the extent that I would like to see. I guess, kind of maybe somewhat copped out answer, but I'd kind of be interested to know what Alice thinks about that, if she would be willing to chat back.
We'll see if Alice responds in the comments. Okay, so I'll keep an eye on that, and if she does, then we will.
Okay.
I'll put that to you.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I have some more questions. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is how you talked about how the rise of women in professional and managerial jobs, while positive for many reasons, has had uneven effects in producing some inequalities amongst women too.
Yeah. Well, take the example of support for increased spending in work family benefits and childcare. That is paid parental leave or childcare. If you're in the US, if you're a woman in a well-paying professional managerial job, it's really not a problem for you, because employers of that category of workers tend to offer those benefits privately. Okay, and often those women have enough money to hire domestic servants to help them out. And when there's a big supply of low-wage immigrant women in the cities they live in, it's very cheap for them to hire that kind of domestic help. And in fact, there's research showing that women with a college education are more likely to earn more if they live in a city where there's a lot of low-wage domestic servants. So though that group of women is much less likely to want to form an alliance with other women around public policies, because they've actually, those policies, the effect of those policies is buffered for them by their class and race position, right? Now, some of them support it anyway because they think it's good in principle, right? And I think there are alliances around those issues, but I think that again, it's sort of a complicated strategic question. You could think of it this way: am I better off on my own, given that I earn a lot of money? Why should I invest in trying to work with other women to change this law, right? Versus, it's not that much work and it's actually quite rewarding to make history by changing our social and political infrastructure. And I think those two things, there's a kind of dance back and forth between those two things at the party.
I suppose that's a little bit of a depressing thought, but then this can be overcome through changing cultural norms, or how?
Well, I don't think it's a depressing thought. I think it's about having a realistic understanding of the obstacles that you face, right? And just because something is hard doesn't mean you shouldn't fight for it, right? In fact, that's exactly why you should fight for it, is that it's really hard. So I don't think it matters a lot whether we're optimistic or pessimistic about the future. If we want to, we should do the right thing, whether we're optimistic or pessimistic. It's actually much braver to do the right thing if you're pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
So I give the pessimists credit, right? They hang in there, even though they're skeptical, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to be a cheerful person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's quite an optimistic way to look at pessimism, I suppose.
Well, I don't know.
Alice Palmer has responded if you'd like
Yeah,
to
what does
respond.
Alice say? Yeah.
She says, haha, I agree. As far as I know, they fare significantly better with the child penalty and tend to have less stagnant unemployment. And much of this is attributed to a service-heavy welfare model. What do you believe is missing?
Well, first of all, I really like the points that Alice has made, but it's also true that women in Sweden are very concentrated in the public sector, and they're concentrated in less prestigious and powerful jobs than men are. And I think that leaves those Nordic countries vulnerable, in a way, politically vulnerable to kind of a backlash against social provision. I'd like to see women have more economic independence and more economic parity with men than they do in Sweden. And I think there are a lot of Swedish women that, and Nordic women in general, that feel the same. Who knows?
And we have a question from Alexandra. She says, hello, I'm in a youth wing of a left-wing party in Poland. We are very saddened by what is going on in Poland, has been in fact going on. How do you think we can educate our society in a way to break through populist rhetoric in time by democratic means? It also is hard to go to debates with far-right politicians and kill their rhetoric by arguments, as the youth's emotional involvement is draining. Thank you.
I really feel for Poland. I think it's a very difficult political situation. And I just don't have any great wisdom to offer about strategy, except, patience, persistence, determination. And let me just say that I lived through 4 years of an administration in this country that was really horrifying to me and made me feel like it would, we were all doomed forever, no matter what. And we managed to make a political regime change in November by a very, very small margin. And I mean, a really tiny margin in terms of the Electoral College. And to me, that means that every single activist who went out there and tried to increase voter registration, and every single activist who went to rallies and said, no, you're wrong, I don't agree, I'm sorry, this is, this is wrong. They all take the credit for that. I think that maybe one of the reasons I'm more optimistic is that we finally achieved a small but significant transition here in the US. And I dearly hope that will also prove true for Poland.
And to finish up, I thought I might ask some slightly different questions. So firstly, what is your advice for us as young people? This, I suppose, is quite related to what you just said to Alexandra, but what is your advice for us as young people who want to make change and to tackle the kinds of issues that you care so passionately about?
Be bold. My main advice is be bold. Don't be timid. Don't be hesitant to challenge the existing way of thinking about things. This is how change occurs, through a younger generation that comes to a different understanding of the world. And so you are the agents of change. And remember that and go for it.
And Alice has added a nice response. She said, thank you so much, Dr. Folbre. I first came upon your work whilst writing an essay on the gender division of labour, and I really resonate with a lot of your work.
Oh, Alice, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking. And Naman, I thought you asked really good questions, and I really benefited from the back and forth. It was really good.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really, really fascinating and so interesting discussion.
Yeah, I really think you all are on a very good path. You're on a very good path. So keep going.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe to finish up then, I ask quite a light question. What are you reading, and what should we be reading?
Oh, the book I have most enjoyed reading for both political and aesthetic reasons this year is a book by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry for the Future. And it's about a time in the not too distant future where climate change has become a really, really disastrous phenomenon. And it describes the efforts of people who formed this group called the Ministry for the Future that's trying to figure out how to mitigate basically the political institutions that have caused this really disastrous shift. And it starts out, let me just warn you that it starts out it's very depressing and very discouraging, because it starts out with some really horrific crises. But as the book proceeds, you really see the value of people just sticking with it in a very patient and persistent way, and using a lot of different avenues to try and respond in a constructive and progressive way. And also the characters in it are they're very real characters. They're not, they're not caricatures, and nothing is easy for them, but they also derive a lot of satisfaction from what they achieve. So I really recommend it to you, The Ministry for the Future.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant, and I've made a note. And for everybody that's watching, another book that you should definitely be looking out for is The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems, an Intersection of Political Economy. When is that coming out, Professor Folbre?
It's out now. It's out.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So download it right now, guys. Thank you so much, Professor Folbre.
Thank you, Norman.
It's been fantastic.
Okay, good luck. Bye.
Okay. Bye.